Welcome to the next in our series of CHASM Research Seminars. We're really pleased to welcome today Dr. Micheal Collins, who's an Assistant Professor in Social Policy at the University College of Dublin. Micheal is going to talk to us to a title of Who Benefits from Zero and Exempt Rates of VAT? A distribution analysis of Ireland and the UK. Micheal is well placed to talk to this subject, as he is an economist and a researcher in tax and social policy, was a member of the Irish Tax Commission of a number of years ago, and is widely published in tax and social policy. He's doing this work under the banner of being an International Research Fellow for CHASM for 2020. And so we're working together with him to develop this work that he'll be presenting today. We're really pleased, Micheal, that you've come to share with us how your work is going and the things that you've found so far. We're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say today. Thank you very much.
It's nice to have an opportunity to talk about this research. Hopefully all the technology works along the way. The title, as you will have seen from the invite and so on, is Who Benefits from 0% and Exempt Rates of VAT? And it's a distributive assessment, which, as you'll see from this project, is looking both at Ireland and at the UK. And what I'm going to do in terms of working through this over the next few minutes is, well, initially a sort of introduction to all of this, and then I thought I might sketch out a brief context for where all of this sits and the type of research questions that Andy and I are looking at here. And then after that, to talk about VAT, the revenue aspects of it, the structure, and some of the policy issues around that as well. As you'll see, it sort of plays to various different policy themes. Then on to the initial work, at least, that's been done here in terms first of the data that I've been using from that and what the story so far is. And then, as you'll see, that sort of triggers a set of next steps for us, which I'll encourage you to think about, and you may have your own sets of views and ideas, which we'd very much welcome as to what we should or shouldn't do, or what's missing, or what sort of other angles are worth pursuing on this. So to introduce it, really, this is a joint piece of work with Andy, and as he said, part of the International Research Fellowship scheme at CHASM. It's been a bit more international than planned, in that January last year, the plan, Andy and I were having discussions about me having the opportunity to be in Birmingham for about 2 weeks or so. I was looking forward to it, and we could have worked on this, but events have got in the way, as you're well aware. But nonetheless, that hasn't stopped some of the initial phases of the work happening here, and that's sort of triggering an opportunity for us to sketch out the direction of this research project and to build on some of what has already been done. So I'm very much going to talk about phase one of the project today, which has got an Irish focus, as you'll see. And then you'll see we're going to broaden that out to include assessments of the UK, and then to move to some more comparative aspects of it. The two systems, two countries, in terms of their VAT systems, not radically different. There's some differences, as you'll see. So there should be some similarities anyway. And I suppose all of this speaks to a broad set of themes. Themes certainly that align well for Andy and I on this, so taxation overall and the sort of space of tax policy, but clearly also in a social policy space as well. Social policy frequently cited as a reason for some of these VAT structures, which kind of throws up questions, is it or should it be or whatever, which is where we're going here as well. Speaks to an area of tax expenditure I suppose in the social policy literature, often talked about in the space within the concept of fiscal welfare, that the state delivering welfare to individuals via the taxation system. You see that also talked about in terms of ideas like the hidden welfare state. So it's happening, but not people aren't so visibly able to see it. So it's kind of speaking to all of those areas and all of those themes. And I would say, honestly, that's a nice fit for Andy and I put together on this, and sort of works well as a direction for this project. Okay, in terms of that, where all this fits in contextually, and then the research questions that derive from that, let's start with VAT, which really is one of the most far-reaching aspects of the taxation system. Anytime I'm in conversation with people who are giving out about taxation and so on, they start talking about taxpayers, I rather rapidly add to the conversation that my 2 young primary school children are taxpayers, which generally tends to derail them quite a bit, but of course underscores the point that people across all age groups contribute to the tax take, and VAT is very much the way where the vast majority of the population contribute to the state. When we look at the sort of research around that and the questions that are asked, there is really quite frequent assessments of the very visible impacts of VAT. So you've got, and indeed indirect taxation more broadly as well. But on VAT, you've got frequent enough assessments of the distributive aspects of it, who is paying, how that's divided across particular groups in society. The ONS in the UK produce fairly frequently a set of insights into that, as do the Institute for Fiscal Studies as well. There's a nice section in the textbook, Let's Talk About Tax, which I know Andy and others have contributed to, that Jonathan Bradshaw has a chapter in there looking at kind of the overview of the taxation system, which kind of slots VAT into the context of, in a UK context, how people contribute. In Ireland, there's a bit of that too. The Economic and Social Research Institute, one of our research institutes, kind of similar to the IFS, would just started to do some work on this over the last few years as well. I've done some work on this over time too. Our statistics office did for a while do this, and they sort of dropped it or went off their list. I remember them engaging with me when I started looking at this with delight that somebody was doing it, mainly I think so they could cross it off their list firmly and permanently rather than anything else, but they were very encouraging and have been all the way through as well. But you know, those reports are there certainly on those sort of very visible aspects of VAT, how much is being paid, how much is being collected and from whom, and you get fairly frequent policy reports too, looking at some of the sort of policy aims and impacts of VAT as well, particularly when you're looking at, say, short-term measures to reduce VAT, to stimulate aspects of the economy, and to see how much that cost and if it worked or who it benefited and so on too. So there's a reasonable amount of that there. I think comparatively, there's less consideration of what I might describe as the less visible impacts of VAT. That is, you know, what is not by the very structure of the VAT system, as I'll get onto in a while. There is VAT revenue that is not being collected, or it's designed so that it's collected at 0%, is not collected, or it's exempted. There tends to be, or there has been, I think, a limited consideration of that. I would have thought in a normal presentation, I would then dive into big literature that would tell you about all the research work that's been done on that issue and that's been looking at what hasn't been collected and so on and so forth. There's a bit of it out there. I've been digging around and I'm open to suggestions from others. So I've come across various assessments in Canada and South Africa and Germany over the last decade or so on it as well. And I know in the UK, there have been a few studies, including some modeling studies looking at, say, what would be the outcome from a VAT reform if you brought in a flat rate of VAT across everything, which kind of gives you a feel for who would pay more and who would pay less. And you'd have some insight into indirectly, I suppose, then into who would experience a higher level of VAT contribution on the back of that too. And there's a bit of literature there. It's not literature I know enough of, and we'll need to read up a bit more on the sort of evolution of this policy over time and how it's sort of come to look as it has, and the assumptions that underpin it around, say, but to stick with the social policy angle, that there is a driving social policy objective for having 0% and exempt rates of VAT, and that they are serving particular equity objectives. Pulling that together, it's what has led us to have a sort of set of research questions then that we are attempting to look at in the context of this work. So they are, firstly, who benefits from the 0% and exempt VAT rates? And I suppose implicit in that are the questions like, well, do those rates favor lower income households? You know, the argument runs, these are the households that will consume a greater proportion of their resources, who have less resources in the first place, and therefore, in a sense, we should take less away from them or allow them to stretch their resources further, and the 0% and exempt rates are an opportunity to do that. Related to that, there's sort of a question, which I'll come back to in a few minutes, about how much these tax exemptions may cost. And there are some estimates, I'll come back. And then a third, depending on the objective that we're thinking about here, is, well, is this a good use of resources? So in a sense, we've got to figure out how much the resources are, what they're doing, and then that throws up the questions around the effectiveness of it. Which does trigger a later question, which I'll come back to on reform. So that's our first kind of focus. A second sort of bolt-on aspect to that then is to explore if there are differences or similarities between the UK and Ireland. I'll sort of sketch at a very broad level what they are in a second, but that will be an aspect of it as we extend the analysis into the UK. And then I think triggered from all of that is a question. I've put it in italics because I'm not sure we'll go there. Andy and I'll have to have a coffee or something about this to figure it out. But what might a reform look like is a sort of a related question. And if we know what it looks, if we think maybe it is or isn't achieving certain things, it throws up questions of, well, what might you change, or how might you change it, or what might that look like? Actually, that's a kind of an interesting question in the UK context, more so than in an Irish context, actually. The VAT, the ability of countries who are members of the European Union to change their VAT structures is really quite limited. And so, as you'll see in a second, actually, the Irish government have been very good at finding ways of doing it over time. But really, it's very difficult to do that in the context of the common market and the context of fair competition, and not undermining that in various different ways. So governments are really quite tied in terms of what they can do. That changed for the UK on the 1st of January this year, and therefore actually the UK, for the first time probably since I think 1977, would be able, if it wished to change its VAT system whole scale, if it wanted to, or in any direction. Certainly there's a set of policy questions here that were not on the table at all for a very long time, which are at least conceptually back on the table today. Anyway, it's a further context for all of that as well. Okay, so then let's talk about the VAT in terms of the revenue, the structure, and some of the sort of policy aspects of this too. I've just pulled up two tables to show the importance of VAT in terms of the revenue for states. As you look at the screen, then the one on the left is for the UK, and it is the structure of taxation in the UK. I've lifted this table from a chapter that Adrian Zinfield, Sally Ruan, and I have drafted for Maggie May and colleagues who are producing a book on the Student's Companion to Social Policy, and we have a taxation chapter in there. Maggie May requires to completely redraft this table, so we'll see, but this is the draft of the table at least, and it gives you the composition of taxation in the UK for the year 1920 So VAT is 18% of all of the revenue that the UK government takes in. And on the other side, on the right-hand side of that slide then, is the structure of the Irish taxation system. And I just finished writing a chapter on the Irish tax system for a book called The Economy of Ireland in the last few weeks as well. And so I've just taken it from that as well. And so VAT in an Irish context is 19.5% of all of the revenue that the Irish state collects. So the third biggest source of revenue coming into the government, income tax first, social insurance tax second, social insurance second, and then VAT comes in as the third source of tax. Actually, it's intriguing given how important it is, how little attention it gets, and how in a sense structures are just assumed, but really, really important part of the revenue source for states. And if we think of the structure of VAT as well, and actually that differs quite a lot between countries, it may actually explain why there isn't a whole lot of literature out there looking at the various different VAT structures and VAT changes, in that there's only a couple of countries that really have multiple VAT structures that end up really thinking about if there should or shouldn't be changes to it. So when you, if I can sort of summarize the sort of European picture overall, the European continent picture overall of VAT structures, there's quite a number of countries which have what I would think about as a very simple structure in terms of VAT. In other words, they have two rates of VAT, and they tend to also have, well, they all have exemptions as well on top of these rates. And so that's the case in Denmark, that's the case in the Netherlands, and a number of the newer European Union member states have gone down that route. They've got two rates. And then you go to other countries that are a bit more complex in that they have 3 or 4 rates. So the UK, France, Spain, Austria have 3. If you go on to Finland, Italy, and Malta, then they have 4 rates. And then there are a number of countries that are really complex in terms of how they do it, where they have 5 or 6 rates and exemptions. So Belgium and Luxembourg have 5 rates. And I suspect this is news to much of my tax colleagues in Ireland, but Ireland by some distance has the most complex of the whole lot and has 6 rates of VAT in operation as well. If you go back to, I often go back to Adam Smith's canons of taxation, and if you one of them being simplicity, or at least summarized to simplicity, and the Irish system certainly breaks that very, very comfortably when it comes to it. It's not alone, but so the Irish system has 6 rates. And then if we look inside those VAT systems, all countries have exemptions. So there's some goods and services which they've deemed are not subject to VAT. And then to be very honest, as I dug into this, was a bit of a surprise to me, which is that only a small number of countries have 0% rates. So there was a European Union study in 2015, it looked at 27 EU states, and 8 of the 27 had a 0% rate, and then the others did not at all. So it's quite uncommon actually across countries. Although I think all of us, given that it's a norm within the British and the Irish system, just think it's a norm for the VAT system to have a 0% rate. That's not the case when you go and look at other countries. So Belgium, Denmark, Ireland, Italy, Malta, Finland, Sweden, and the UK all have a 0% rate, but then all the other countries do not have any 0% rates. That may further explain why there isn't a whole lot of people looking at this, and that it really does confine those questions to those of us in countries like that, or well, a lot of the questions there anyway. And then the UK, the systems for the rates, you'll be familiar with the UK one. So the standard rate, 20%, reduced rate, 5%, a 0 rate, and an exempt rate or category for VAT. And I thought I'd put that next to the Irish system. So similar structures at different rates. So a standard rate currently 23%, a reduced rate 13.5%. Here's where the fun starts then. A second reduced rate, which is 9%, and then a second reduced rate, which is also 9%. That's actually a temporary rate well, everything starts temporary in tax, and whether it stays temporary is questionable. It rarely does. So temporarily during the economic crash a decade ago, a temporary rate was brought in to boost the leisure sector of hotels, accommodation, food, and so on, at reduced from 13.5% to 9%. That's sort of food as an eating out. Then it was phased out and then rather rapidly reintroduced last year as part of the COVID-19 context as well. And so it continues as part of the system. It's intended to be temporary. Within the system, there's actually an agricultural rate, which is really only for livestock trading and so on, so it doesn't really impact explicitly on consumers. Then a zero rate and an exempt rate as well. So I suppose really consumers are facing the ones that, other than the one that's in grey. Okay, so that's that system there. And then in terms of the policy aspect of it, well, as I kind of said, given the revenue, I think it's not talked about a whole lot. The visible aspects are who pays the distribution of that. The design or structure of the system doesn't tend to get a whole lot of focus. But I suppose if it does have a policy side, you know, the policy side is speaking to it playing a role in terms of raising revenue, really important for the state, in terms of equity and equity objectives that are being pursued by the design of the system, and also a role to stimulate particular activity in the economy at particular points in time, when generally when things are needed to be picked up. I haven't seen it being used. I'm open to correction as a sort of behavioral tax to slow things down. I suppose our focus here is on equity and on that equity aspect of it, and it sits into that policy space. So I wanted to briefly mention too, before I go on to sort of the initial set of results on all of this, a point around the costings of these tax breaks. So in the abstract, which will have been circulated around, I cited the figures from HMRC for the UK, who do produce estimates for the costs of these tax breaks, so that the decision not to collect VAT, or to collect VAT at 0% rather than to collect VAT at a particularly higher rate. Actually, the costings are challenging because it depends what you are benchmarking it against. So you get a different answer. Clearly, if you instead of collecting your tax or having a zero rate, you had the standard rate, and that's an amount of money. Or instead of having the zero rate, you move the items that are at zero or that are exempt to the reduced rate. Or you could have some type of hybrid rate notionally in between, which sort of kept things revenue neutral overall, but sort of shifted the structure of tax revenue too. As I said, HMRC provide estimates for that. It wasn't clear to me actually precisely how they are costing that and to which rate they are going to get their figure. But that may be because I just need to dig a bit deeper into that, the data and the documents from them to figure it out. The Irish Revenue Commissioner, so the Irish comparative body, don't produce costs for these tax breaks, albeit that they do provide figures for what might be a revenue neutral structure for a reformed VAT system. And so implicitly that means they have an assumption, which they don't publish, as to what the revenue would likely be were you to move the revenue that's being foregone or lost from having 0% rates in particular. That's probably another cup of coffee with somebody from the Irish Revenue Commissioners for me to interrogate exactly where they're going there, because it would be interesting to get at those numbers too. So the costing of that is tricky, and we'll probably come back at that later on in the research. Okay, so let me kind of move myself towards some of the results here. So as I said, the first aspect of this research has been for me to carry this out for in an Irish context, and then we're going to extend it into the UK subsequently. So I've been using the Irish Household Budget Survey to do this. So that's the equivalent of the Living Costs and Food Survey in the UK. And the Irish Household Budget Survey, collected by our statistics office, the Central Statistics Office, they do it every 5 years. So the most recent one was 2015-16. It was supposed to have just come out of the field this month, but of course COVID has stopped that, so that survey hasn't gone ahead this year. It's been delayed for a while. The data I'm using here is 6,839 households, and I've been using the micro data from the household budget survey then to do the analysis. I'll save you the misery and all of that. There was a fair amount of it, I have to be honest, but it did require the coding of all of the 517 expenditure items or services that are listed in that data. So each of them then was allocated a particular VAT category given the structures. Most of the time that was easy, but some of them are quite difficult to either make a judgment call or figure out how they should be accounted for. I've also done that for the excises and the levies that are other indirect taxes that arise on some of these goods and services as well. The data then was equivalized, so to adjust for household size and composition, and then income deciles gross income deciles were generated. So we're slotting everybody into people in the lowest 10% of the population in income terms, corrected for household size and composition, all the way up to those in the top 10% of the income distribution. And in effect, therefore, it's been set up as a model, clunky, I have to admit, but a model nonetheless that will allow you to begin to do these estimates and then to figure out what the implications are, or the outcomes at least are on that. So let me give you the story so far on this. As I said, it's an Irish story because I'm using Irish data for this. We will expand it in time. To be honest, given the VAT structures and the household composition patterns, I wouldn't anticipate there'll be dramatically differences between the outcomes for the UK and what we find for Ireland. But we don't know, which is why we want to ask the question. And there are differences in the system, but they're not too dramatic. For now, anyway, and I suppose that's probably because they've sat within an entire European system up until recently, so the ability to have differences wasn't as present as conceptually it is or can be in the future. And so I've got results here, so I'm going to kind of go through those reasonably carefully and I hope they're reasonably straightforward to interpret as you see them. So I've kind of broken them into three. Firstly, results for the equivalized gross income deciles and for all. So you'll see that across. So from the bottom 10% up to the top 10%. And I've stuck on a column at the end, which is for all. So it captures the society as a whole, so the overall average. I'm going to look at the composition of expenditure first on these items, the 0% and the exempt, and then I'm going to look at the nominal expenditure on the items subject to VAT at 0% and items subject to VAT exemption. And I've broken that down by expenditure category, so you can see what aspect is food and what aspect are other things as well. So hopefully that'll be self-explanatory as we go through here. So firstly, if we look at the composition of household spending, and so then I've broken that down across each of the different VAT rates. As a start, incidentally, household expenditure doesn't go up to or isn't capturing 100% of expenditure here, because there are certain things like, for example, spending on foreign holidays or transfers to other households or individuals, or taxes and so on, which don't fit into the VAT context. And so that will explain the housing purchases are also in there actually, which explain the difference between the top of the columns and 100%. And so the blue here is, the blue and the red is what I'm going to focus in on. So this is the expenditure by each decile on goods and services that are taxable or VATable at 0%, or at for blue, or exempt for the red. So I can sort of get rid of the other columns. It's really these ones that I'm looking at across the income distribution. And what does that show? Well, as a proportion of household expenditure, at least households at the bottom of, there's not a huge difference actually across the distribution, but at the bottom of the distribution, households are spending more on the 0%, well, combined together at least the 0% and the exempt items than is the case right up at the very top of the distribution. 14% of the expenditure of the bottom decile is on items that are subject to 0% VAT, whereas it's 7% at the top, and 27% of the expenditure in the bottom decile is on items that are exempt from VAT, whereas it's at 19% up at the top. So there is some difference if you go across proportionally as a proportion of expenditure for that. They're not dramatic differences, actually, certainly not for the 0% expenditure as a proportion of expenditure, at least there. But I thought it would be also useful to look at this nominally, so to look at it as in cash terms, because it tends to be how we look at tax expenditure, so the value of it to an individual in terms of their how much tax they are not paying because of the decision around the introduction of the tax expenditure. So to get at that, I haven't estimated that, but I've gone to look at the composition in nominal terms, so in cash terms. These are in euro per week of expenditure at 0%. And so then I've broken that down to look at it by different categories of expenditure. So green is for food consumed in the home. And so most, not all of that, but a lot of that is at 0%. And then there's some clothing and footwear, principally around children, actually, which is taxed at 0% as well. There is some housing expenditure, a very small amount actually to with water charges at the time, which was at 0% as well. There are some what are described statistically as household non-durables, but I looked in to see what they were, and they are principally nappies and other sort of things to do with babies, which is at 0%. That's that black bit. And then the final bit is our other, which are principally capturing things like medicines and prescription medication, which fit into that other category at 0% there. So that gives you then the nominal value and the breakdown of that nominal value by across all of those groups of expenditure. And you can see there, that's kind of interesting actually, across every category more or less, the 0% relief is worth more in nominal terms the further up the income distribution you go. And if you did it across a year, if you compare the top to the bottom, there's a difference of about €540 a year between the value of expenditure at 0%. In other words, the top decile has €540 a year. That's not far off £500 a year more than at the bottom. And I also did a breakdown for the exempt VAT categories as well. So expenditure that is deemed to be exempt from VAT. And so I've only put in the categories where expenditure arises. So that's in housing, transport, and kind of a basket of others. And you can see that in a more pronounced way, perhaps, has well, there's a dip for the second and third deciles, but is a bit more skewed towards the top of the income distribution as well. The housing stuff is around rent and insurance and house purchases. The transport issues are around insurance costs again, and some ticket costs. And the other has to do principally driven by things like childcare and education fees and financial services costs and bank fees and so on, which make up that grey part of the columns as well. And again, that exemption is skewed up the distribution as well. I think the nominal figures are useful because if we were going to go and figure out, well, what is the value of that exemption, it's going to be a percentage of those nominal figures. So it will give you the same pattern overall if you go up the distribution. So a final slide, because I know there'll be people I'm sure want to give out or ask questions or whatever. So the next steps for this as a project for us, firstly, there's some refining to be done on the Irish analysis that I've showed you there. There's kind of an interesting issue around mortgage payments, which I haven't quite got my head around yet as to whether a house purchase is deemed to be exempt. So what do you do with mortgage payments? And which is in a sense partially at least the purchase of a house elongated over a period. And there's some refinements to the calculations for children's clothing and footwear, which I'll do as well. And then it will extend that very similarly to the UK Living Costs and Food Survey to do the analysis there, and then do the comparison, which is really where we want to go from here. And then to begin to explore some of those issues there, the equity issues I mentioned earlier, sort of related to that deadweight issues around the use or not, or good use or not of these resources. And that throws up some of those alternative questions as well for us to pursue. And so those are directions that we plan to follow as we go on from here. And that brings me to the end, Andy, so I'm going to stop there, stop sharing, and come back to you.